a Russian KGB agent. So it caused the downfall of the British government at that time. A lot of parties were being held at the Astor's estate at Cliveden in the United Kingdom. And one of the people who was the center of this was a man called Stephen Ward. Stephen Ward was kind of the procurer, you might say. He was the friend of all of the girls who were involved in the call girl operation. And he was believed to have been involved in the occult very heavily. When he died, he committed suicide rather than go to jail for his role in the affair. They called in an exorcist to exorcise the house where he was living. I mean, there's always been some kind of strange occult connection between the Astor family and the occult in general. We can't quite figure out what that means because, of course, penetrating the Astor family is rather difficult, trying to understand all of their secrets. But there does seem to be this fascination between, with the Astor family and occult forces. I believe John Jacob Astor had written books about spiritual things before. I believe he was the one who went down on the Titanic. So there are all sorts of strange associations with the Astors. And as far as the Forbes and the DuPonts, that's another whole story. I mean, there's a lot of occult history with the old wealthy families. And whether they became wealthy because of the occult or whether they were wealthy first and used that money to investigate the occult, in my mind, at this stage of the game, it doesn't matter which came first, the horse or the cart. But obviously they have had quite an influence and are still having quite an influence in our political life.
Yeah, indeed. In regards to that, do you necessarily see this as something negative to be, I guess in quotes, dabbling with the occult, or do you think that we as a human race actually could learn something from this? I mean, in regards to, I guess, more the shamanistic ways that you spoke of earlier. In regards to that, there are numerous stories going back to the shamans actually extracting useful information while they are in contact with these spirits and so forth. Do you have a kind of a negative or positive, connotation on this aspect of it?
Well, from my own point of view, I've always regarded organized religion with suspicion. It's as though we relegate the care of our souls to a human organization. And my experience with human organizations has not been that positive. I'm not exactly sure, what human being I would entrust with my soul, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
So I generally prefer. Well, think about it. We have so many scandals in the United States in recent years involving heads of major religious organizations, Protestant organizations, Catholic organizations. I mean, there's no way that you could reasonably be expected to surrender, the care and taking of that immortal or spiritual part of yourself to people who are engaged in all sorts of unsavory behavior. So, from my point of view, direct spiritual experience is always preferable. The problem is, of course, it takes effort, and it takes a bit of education in the sense of having to learn the safeguards, having to learn what the spiritual experience means, learning how to interpret it or understand it. So it's a lot of personal responsibility.
Yeah.
But from my point of view, what greater task do we have? So I believe that studying the occult may actually be a good thing for the rest of us. It may empower us and give us back control of the spiritual part of our lives and take it away from people who have shown to us that they are not really worthy of being in charge of it themselves.
Yeah, indeed. What about the connection between the U.S. and the Nazis? I guess we could go back to talk about the paperclip and stuff like this, connecting, I guess, OSS, the foundation, going over to CIA and so forth. But do you go into the Nazi connection with the U.S. in Sinister Forces at all?
Well, I do, of course. In Unholy Alliance I did, in the book directly about the Nazis, but then I expanded that considerably in Sinister Forces, because the more I researched things like Operation Paperclip, the more shocked I became, and my hair gradually turned whiter with each new revelation. For instance, not only the Nixon, but the Bush family. This is something that no one talks about on CNN or any of the news stations. They never have, and I guess they never will. And it's something is deeply disturbing to me. The Bush family, going back to the 1920s and 1930s, the grandparents of the current president, were very involved with the Nazis. I mean, involved to the point where the U.S. government had to shut them down in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act because their companies were actively involved in supporting the Third Reich. Now, we're talking about families like the Bush family, Prescott Bush, the Walker family, Brown Brothers Harriman, which was one of their companies. All of George Herbert Walker and Prescott Bush were major supporters of the Third Reich. They financed a bunch of German scientists to come over to the United States in the 1930s to talk about eugenics, which is essentially race science, especially in the Nazi point of view. And their idea was to clean up the human race by getting rid of undesirables. So the Bush family was directly involved in supporting that kind of those conferences in the United States. So there's a history there. And then we have the Nixon situation where Nixon, after the end of World War II, was sent to Washington, D.C., where he worked, as we later found out, going over the captured German documents and files. It is assumed that he found something in those German documents which made Allen Dulles befriend him right away. We know that Allen Dulles was involved in discussions with high-ranking Nazis during the war. And we also know that Allen Dulles had virtually no objections to the Holocaust, as is exposed in the transcripts of his meetings with the Nazis. He really didn't care much one way or the other about the death camps. He just wanted the Nazis to surrender. So it's possible that Nixon uncovered something about Dulles, and Dulles, to keep Nixon quiet, started to support him as a candidate in Congress, because Nixon basically was a very unattractive candidate for many reasons. But suddenly he had a lot of money behind him, a lot of oil money, a lot of old money behind him, and Dulles' support for the race that he ran against Helen Gahagan Douglas in California, where he eventually became a senator, and then from there went on to become president eventually. So vice president and then president. So there was a definite connection between Nixon, Dulles, and paperclip the Nazis, and we don't really know all the ramifications of it yet. There's just a lot of smoking guns. And investigators like me are still working on that. It
is a history that's somewhat clouded, but as you say, it feels like more and more is coming out and it's becoming known, even if that all of it might be spin or whatever. But I mean, do you think that there is a connection also to, I guess, the birth of the CIA in connection to the Nazis that went over to the U.S.?
Oh, sure. I mean, from our records and from the records that are being declassified almost every day, we've been discovering that the kinds of Nazis we brought over, we're not only rocket scientists, but we're also involved in medical experimentation. Most of those wound up at Randolph Air Force Base, where they created a department of aviation medicine, as it was called. But these were people who were responsible for some terrible crimes during the Holocaust. We had Nazis involved in our political life. We had ex-Nazis and ex-SS officers involved in raising money for the Republican Party during the Cold War. We had Ronald Reagan, for instance, giving speeches to the World Anti-Communist League and supporting the World Anti-Communist League, which was a notorious hotbed of Nazis and neo-Nazis. We've had Nazis in virtually every aspect of our political life after World War II, including running our CIA European operations against the Soviet Union. We brought over an entire SS battalion from Ukraine. We rescued them from Nuremberg. Klaus Barbie we sent to Bolivia after he was no longer of any use to us here. And Klaus Barbie, a famous SS officer who was responsible for many killings in the city of Lyon in France, wound up running the intelligence services for the Bolivian government at one point. We were up to our neck in Nazis, and to their benefit, people like Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, and others protested greatly that we were doing this and bringing the Nazis over. We're very public about it. President Truman sent a letter to the Army saying, "You will not import any more Nazis. Thank you very much. And the army ignored him.
Yeah.
They ignored a presidential order and continued to do it anyway. So we're surrounded. I mean, we made a deal with the devil because we were afraid of the Soviet Union. And I believe in that deal we bartered our soul. And I think that's when we started to say to ourselves, the end justifies the means.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't care if we're dealing with Nazis with blood on their hands. You know, we want an advantage against the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I think this is where we went astray. We began to go astray right there. And I think it culminated in the assassination of Kennedy, who was threatening to undo a lot of that damage by making deals with the Soviet Union, by agreeing to deals with Khrushchev over Cuba, so on and so forth. I think that those powers that came in, those beings that came into power at the end of World War II were extremely upset by all of this. So from my point of view, it was a combination of things that resulted in that assassination. And the Nazis figure prominently in this. I mean, what's fascinating to me is that the people who worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans at the O'Reilly Coffee Company in New Orleans all got jobs in the aviation business as soon as Oswald was arrested. I mean, virtually the whole company had to close because all the people who worked with Oswald got jobs with NASA, with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or in some other form of the aviation industry.
Yeah.
The person who, Michael Payne, who was Ruth Payne's husband. Ruth Payne, of course, was that woman with whom the Oswalds were staying. Her husband worked for Bell Aerospace. And his boss was Walter Dornberger. Walter Dornberger was the Nazi general we brought over at the end of World War II to run our space program. He and Werner von Braun.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the connection, the Nazi connection to the assassination is there as well. And we don't quite understand what all that means either. But there's a definite connection.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, connection. Of course, Werner von Braun being the developer, I guess, in that sense of the V2 rocket and all of that. And one thing, when you said rocket scientist, that I immediately come to think of people like, Jack Parsons, of course. I guess they're referred to as the Babylon Bunch in some circles. And they were in the White Sands area, the missile testing range in New Mexico, of course. But in your research, or if you're, if you will, do you think that we can tie kind of all of this stuff together in a kind of a occult aspect? People like Jack Parsons connecting with Werner von Braun, connected with, I guess, even L. Ron Hubbard in some sense. Do you kind of want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, it's worthwhile exploring, and I try to do this in Sinister Forces, but there's such a wealth now of data that we're still sifting through it to find the connections. Obviously, Jack Parsons was a very important person in the history of aerospace research. Parsons was one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, which is, of course, now world famous for the moonshots and for all of the aerospace stuff that we undertake. But he was an occultist. He was a devoted follower of Aleister Crowley. We're talking probably the more hardcore of the occultists of the last century, were people who followed Aleister Crowley. So here's Jack Parsons, who identifies himself as the Antichrist, and he's working on top secret classified government rocket research. And with him, down in Pasadena, in California, is a science fiction author who's after World War II, and that's L. Ron Hubbard, the man who would eventually found Scientology. And Hubbard is learning a great deal from Parsons. And in the 1950s, L. Ron Hubbard would make speeches to his fellow Scientologists about how great Aleister Crowley was and how he learned so much from Aleister Crowley. He even claimed to have known Aleister Crowley, which is patently false. Crowley died in 1947 before Hubbard became involved in any of this. But there is this idea that Scientology, Aleister Crowley, occultism, you may want to call it black magic in some cases, all inextricably tied together with Jack Parsons, with the space program, and eventually with the UFO phenomenon, which was also taking place in 1947, the same year that the CIA was created. And so we have people like Fred Krisman, who was in on the ground floor of the very first UFO phenomenon in the United States in the late 20th century in 1947. Fred Krisman, who claims that a UFO was dropping molten lead or molten metal of some kind on top of him and killed his dog and hurt his boat. Here's a guy who shows up later in 1968